The United States is not unfamiliar to areas of reform. You may remember back in the Gilded Age, a new wave of progressivism called to reform education, slavery, and alcohol, along with many other issues. By the time we reached the Gilded Age, small reform movements had began to spring up in cities with the social gospel movement, but probably the most significant root to the 20th century progressivism was the Populist Party of the West. Though the Populist Party was largely a failure, the ideas of direct election of senators, graduated income tax, and government regulation of railroad remained behind. And these ideas are going to inspire the new wave of progressives. The new progressives were very worried that more and more power was being collected into the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that only the expansion of the power of government could have enough power to take on the big businesses and political machines. Here's the author of your textbook, David Kennedy. An outworn philosophy of hands-off individualism seemed increasingly out of place in the modern machine age. Social and political problems were now too complex for intentionally small government. And it's very important to know that though we refer to the progressives as this large overarching group, the progressives were not a unified movement. The term progressive is a catch-all name for reformers that each had a focus on different problems at the federal, state, and local level. So a progressive, for instance, may be interested in reforming the consumption and sale of alcohol, but indifferent to other issues like women's rights and labor issues. The people who are most responsible for locating the areas of reform were the journalists called the muckrakers. The muckrakers were investigative journalists that would expose problems in American society by writing articles about the problems and shine a bright light on the problems by publishing articles in popular muckraking magazines and newspapers. The muckrakers that we're going to talk about in the 1900s have an origin that begins before 1900. In 1894, one writer attacked the bloated and corrupt trust of Standard Oil in his book, Wealth Against the Commonwealth. And he's going to brand Rockefeller and Standard Oil with the stigma of corruption and wrongdoing. A few years later, in 1899, a guy by the name of Thorstein Veblen wrote a scathing book that blasts the entire wealthy class. In Veblen's book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, he said the upper class was a parasite because they took part in wasteful business by, quote, making money for money's sake, unquote, rather than making goods that satisfied the real needs of society. Another notable author who was able to shine a light on the embarrassing effect of the Gilded Age was Jacob Riis. In 1890, Jacob Riis drew attention to the tenement housing conditions, and he'll shock middle-class America with the publishing of his famous How the Other Half Lives. His account was a damning indictment of the disease, the dirt, the vice and misery of dumbbell tenements in places like the New York slums. Here's an excerpt from How the Other Half Lives. Long ago, it was said, quote, one half of the world does not know how the other half lives, end quote. That was true then. It did not know because it did not care. The half that was on top cared little for the struggles and less for the fate of those who were underneath, so long as it was able to hold them there and keep them in their seat. There came a time where the discomfort and the consequent evils so violent that it was no longer an easy thing to do, and that the upper half feel to inquiring what was the matter. Information on the subject had been accumulating rapidly since, and the whole world has had its hands full of answering for its old ignorance. By 1902, the exposing of evil became a flourishing industry among the American publishers. A group of aggressive 10 to 15 cent popular magazine surged to the front, notably McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, and Everybody's. Waging fierce circulation wars, they dug deep for dirt and sensationalized that dirt with which people loved to hate. Because newspapers and magazines dug so deep and sensationalized so much that in 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt created the name muckrakers for these journalists, a name that would stick with them for the rest of history. Here's the Republican Teddy Roosevelt chastising journalists for being excessively negative and sensational. Now, it is very necessary that we should not flinch from seeing what is vile and debasing. There is filth on the floor, and it must be scraped up with the muck rake. And there are times and places where this service is most needed of all the services that can be performed. But the man who never does anything else, who never thinks or speaks or writes, save of his feats with the muck rake, speedily becomes not a help to society, not an incitement to good, but one of the most potent forces of evil. But despite the presidential scolding, these muckrakers are wildly popular. McClure's magazine, for instance, had one of the most famous publications of all time, and the magazine spent significant amounts of money to draw famous muckrakers from all over the country to its company. Some of their most scandalous exposures by muckrakers were published as best-selling books. Famous McClure magazine muckraker Lincoln Steffens attacked the influence of big business and political machines on local government in his book, Shame of the Cities. Here's Steffens. Bribery is no ordinary felony, but treason. Corruption which breaks out here or there and now and then is not an occasional offense, but a common practice, and the effect of it is literally to change the form of our government from one that is representative of the people to an oligarchy, representative of special interests. Another McClure's muckraking author, Ida Tarbell, made a name for herself also by attacking Standard Oil. Tarbell's father's company was ruined by competing with John Rockefeller, so she took to the press with a shockingly scathing, popular series of articles attacking Rockefeller and his wrongdoings while running Standard Oil. Here's Tarbell. Rockefeller has a genius for detail and has rare strength in energy and intelligence. He would have never achieved his monopoly without special transportation privileges. With competition practically out of the way, Standard Oil set its great energies to developing what it had. Human experience long ago taught us that if we allow a man or a group of men autocratic power in government or church, they will use that power to oppress and defraud the public. And what are we to do about it? For this is our business. We, the people of the United States, and nobody else, must cure what is wrong with the industrial situation, typified by this narrative of the growth of Standard Oil Company. Tarbell's expose on Rockefeller and Standard Oil made her a hero among the media. The Los Angeles Times says, the strongest intellectual force among women in the United States. The Outlook says, a Joan of Arc among moderns, crusading against trusts and monopolies. And the guy who owned McClure, Sam McClure, sends a message to Tarbell saying, you are today the most famous woman in America. And probably most hilariously, definitely, she received an oddly backhanded compliment from the Washington Post. Quote, Mr. Rockefeller would be glad to pay the expense if some man would win Miss Ida Tarbell and take her on a leisurely tour of the world for a honeymoon. Also, a McClure's magazine alum, a guy by the name of Ray Stanner Baker, writes a book called Following the Color Line about the subjugation of what was about 9 million African Americans in the New South. He reported that there are still 1/3 of African Americans that are illiterate, mostly from the oppression that they received stemming all the way back to the Reconstruction era. Other famous muckrakers included people like Harvey Wiley, who reported on the very addictive and even hurtful drugs found in medicine, and Upton Sinclair, whose book, The Jungle, focused the attention of the American people and even President Roosevelt on the conditions of the meatpacking industry. We're going to talk about Upton Sinclair later. Here's your author, David Kennedy. Full of sound and fury, the muckrakers signified much about the nature of the progressive reform movement. To right social wrongs, they counted on publicity and aroused American conscience, not drastic political change. They sought not to overthrow capitalism, but to cleanse it. The cure for the ills of American democracy, they earnestly believe, was more democracy. So if the muckrakers were the fuel to the progressive fire, then who were the progressives? The answer to this is more difficult because, as I said before, the progressives were from all different lives and were progressives about all different things. However, they were similar in that the progressives sought to modernize American institutions to achieve two chief goals: to use the state to curb monopoly power, and to use the state to improve the common person's condition of life and labor. One of the first objectives of the progressives is to curb the growing power into the hands of big businesses and political parties. They largely supported the initiative, referendum, and recall that was the focus of the old Populist Party. Additionally, the introduction of the secret Australian ballot also helped stem the corruption in politics. With the Australian ballot, voters could vote in private without bosses or corrupt officials knowing who the person voted for. Also, to bring more power back to the people, the progressives urged for direct election of senators. Once again, another Populist Party holdover. Since senators were elected by state legislatures, the prevalence of corruption was astounding because the political machines typically controlled those state legislatures. By making the senators to be voted in directly by the people, the senators were forced to appeal to the common person and less to corrupt interests. It doesn't fix it altogether, but less. And the progressives will ultimately win this battle as the 17th Amendment was approved in 1913, requiring direct election of senators from all states around the country. Some progressives also shifted the focus towards women's suffrage, a goal of many female reformers for several decades. Liberal states in the West, like California, Oregon, Washington, offered suffrage to women before other states. However, national suffrage would still be a decade away. And as we look at some localities, some of the greatest gains were in the cities. Cities like Galveston, Texas, put experts in positions to manage urban affairs, leading to a more honest conduct of local government. Here, we also see the start of a movement that swept the United States: public ownership of utilities such as water. At the state level, there are two significant examples of progressivism at work. We can look at Wisconsin and California, who will become very progressive states during this time. These two states will become the model of progressivism in the 20th century, as they are going to look at using the power of government to fix issues across their state. Their governors from Wisconsin, Robert Sweet Haircut La Follette, ooh, look at that haircut, and California's Hiram Johnson made names for themselves by taking on the powerful trusts of the state, corruption, and political machines. However, when we start looking at who's doing the legwork for the progressive movement, we find out, unsurprisingly, women prove themselves to be an indispensable part of the progressive army. This should come to no surprise, because you may remember that in past eras of reform, such as the antebellum era reforms, that women, specifically middle-class women, have played a significant role in reform movements since the early 1800s, and thus women's involvement in reform movements have been a continuity across time. Here's David Kennedy again. The campaigns for factory reform and temperance particularly attracted women foot soldiers. Unsafe and unsanitary sweatshops, factories where workers toiled long hours for low wages, were the public scandal in many cities. Famous women like Florence Kelley took control of the National Consumers League and organized women across the country to safeguard women and children in the workplace. The campaign to protect women became a nationwide campaign within the first decade. Their move to make the workplace better for women began to show some fruit, especially in the state of Oregon. Oregon passed a law limiting the amount of factory hours that can be worked by women. However, the problem was that may seem like a law that is fairly discriminatory because it protects one group over another, and if that is the case, it may violate the 14th Amendment. And so this new law would be challenged in the Supreme Court. Luckily for Kelley and the National Crusaders, a guy by the name of Louis Brandeis, a famous attorney, stepped in and promised to argue the case for the Supreme Court. To that, everybody was excited. Louis Brandeis arrived at the Supreme Court to argue the groundbreaking case Mueller versus Oregon. So let's go back in time to see how the case was settled. The essential question asked in Muller versus Oregon was, does the Oregon law limiting the number of hours that women worked violate the 14th Amendment? And the thing is that it seems archaic now, but one of Brandeis's primary arguments was that factory work was harder on women's weaker bodies. So what did the court think? Does the Oregon law violate the 14th Amendment? The court responded with a resounding no, which means it is constitutional to limit the hours worked by women. Here's your author. Although this argument calling for the special protection for women seems discriminatory by later standards and closed many male jobs to women, progressives at the time hailed Brandeis's achievement as a triumph over existing legal doctrine, which afforded employers total control over the workplace. The case Muller versus Oregon in 1908 changed the ruling that the court made 3 years ago in Lochner versus New York in 1905. In the Lochner case, the court ruled that the state can't restrict the number of hours someone can work. However, the Muller case stipulated that the state can restrict the hours that women worked. The use of courts didn't stop there. Progressives were able to get more restrictions put into place to help the lives of many people. Here's Kennedy. Yet the reformist progressive wave finally washed up into the judiciary, and in 1917 the court upheld a 10-hour law for all factory workers. Not all reforms by progressives were proactive. Some of the laws put into place to protect laborers were more reactive. Laws regulating factories were worthless if not enforced, a truth horribly demonstrated by a lethal fire in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City. At the Triangle Shirtwaist Companies, managers would frequently lock fire escapes to prevent workers from taking longer breaks, and there would be no regard to the pile of flammable materials that would eventually cause one of the most significant workplace accidents in American history. The piles of flammable material caught on fire, and the fire spread quickly throughout the top floors of the Triangle building. What was witnessed on that Saturday morning would not be for the faint of heart. Here's your author to explain. Locked doors and flagrant violations of the fire code turned the factory into a death trap. 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women, were incinerated or leaped from the 8th or 9th story windows to their deaths. Lashed by public outcry, including a massive strike by women in the needles trade, the New York legislature passed much stronger laws regulating the hours and conditions of sweatshop toil. Their deaths were not in vain. A wave of workplace reforms began to spread across the country following the fire. By 1917, 37 states passed worker compensation laws that would at least protect workers financially in the case of an accident on the job. Gradually, the concept of the employer's responsibility to society was replacing the old dog-eat-dog philosophy of unregulated free enterprise. Corner saloons or bars became the focus of many progressives, but particularly progressive women. By 1900, some of the largest cities had one saloon for every 200 people, and that's a lot. The desire to limit alcohol is not a new one, but it seems like this time the reform movements may succeed. A progressive named Frances Willard formed the Women's Christian Temperance Society, or WCTU for short, in order to campaign for the elimination of alcohol. She and her army of about 1 million women nationwide would enter and fill the saloons and drop to their knees and pray to end the sale of alcohol. I'm sure that this disruption to business made the saloon owners very uneasy. The campaign continued across the country and in thousands of bars. But it wasn't until Frances Willard and the WCTU teamed up with Wayne Wheeler and the well-organized and well-financed Anti-Saloon League when the progressive movement began making progress toward banning alcohol. Their continued protest and petitioning led to states allowing voters to vote on the issue prohibition of alcohol. David Kennedy again. Caught up in the Crusades, some states and numerous counties passed dry laws, which controlled, restricted, or abolished alcohol. The big cities were generally wet, for they had a large immigrant vote accustomed to the old country, to the free flow of wine and beer. And as you can see by this map, the areas that are dry, shown in white, began taking a larger and larger percentage over the areas that were wet, who were pro-alcohol. Also, it is not coincidental that most dry areas were rural, where most wet areas were urban. This split increased the divide between the people of the cities and the people of the countryside. Now, I've mentioned at the beginning of this section that the attempts to prohibit the consumption and sale of alcohol has been in the making for nearly a century. We remember the American Temperance Society and their attempt to stop consumption of alcohol during the antebellum reform era, which ultimately led to a single state banning alcohol. Now, with the power of the WCTU and the Anti-Saloon League, most of the country banned alcohol by 1914. David Kennedy. When World War I erupted in 1914, nearly one half of the population lived in dry territory, and nearly 3/4 of the total area had outlaw saloons. Demon Rum was groggy and was about to be floored, temporarily, by the 18th Amendment in 1919. Most of the early amendments were amendments to protect individual freedom, and the 18th Amendment is the first amendment that actually restricted individual freedom by prohibiting the sale and purchase of alcohol. Now let's jump into our history time machine and see what happens. It fails. The 18th Amendment will eventually be repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. Prohibition ended up expanding the criminal element in society by creating black markets for alcohol that will be dominated by organized crime. We learned that the half-hearted attempt to control the sale and purchase of alcohol would be way too expensive and thus pointless. Now let's look at a federal response to progressivism as we learn about Teddy Roosevelt. We've learned about Teddy Roosevelt before. Last video we learned that Roosevelt had an aggressive foreign policy, but at home he too was inspired by the progressive wave and became America's first progressive president. Roosevelt's domestic agenda was called the Square Deal, and he said it was a square deal for business, labor, and the public at large. And we remember his agenda with having the 3 C's: corporate regulation, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. Roosevelt is going to change the office of the presidency forever. The most significant change is his use of the presidency as the bully pulpit. See, he realized that the president, more than anyone in any political party, had the ability to speak directly to the American people, and he used his office as the bully pulpit to force the passage of progressive laws by developing a general popular sentiment for the laws he wanted passed. The public then would put pressure on elected officials to help pass regulation, laws, and reform. We remember Roosevelt entering the office in 1901 after McKinley's assassination, and he was tested pretty quickly by the anthracite coal strike less than a year later. Here's some background about the anthracite coal strike. The strike occurs in the coal mining area of eastern Pennsylvania, and in 1900, 2 years before the big strike, the wages became stagnant, mainly due to an increase in laborers to the area. A small strike in 1900 won a 10% wage increase for the workers. However, 2 years later, the same miners decided to strike again, but this time they demanded higher wages and shorter days. Since the company lost the strike in 1900, they would not renegotiate in 1902, leading to 140,000 coal miners to strike across Pennsylvania. But here's the problem. The strike continued from spring to winter, and as the temperature dropped, demand for the remaining coal in the marketplace increased until by September, the price of coal, which was primarily used to heating homes, quadrupled. Knowing that this would eventually come to a head, now is a good time to review how the government typically responded to strikes during the Gilded Age. Many of the major strikes, we remember them: the Great Railroad Strike, the Homestead strike, the Pullman strike, were typically ended by government use of force. With the anthracite coal strike, no one expected any different. However, Roosevelt will shock everyone with his break of tradition. Roosevelt, seeing the increase in the price of heating coal, declared that he would use any of his influences that he could to bring the strike to an end, and he demanded that both sides must negotiate a solution. Of course, the coal owners didn't like this because they believed that the president was negotiating with anarchists and outlaws, and they demanded the president should break the strike with the army. Here's Teddy Roosevelt addressing the coal owners. "If I wasn't in the presidency, I would have taken them out by the seat of their breeches and chucked them out the window." As the strike dragged on, Teddy Roosevelt decided that he would, in fact, use troops. But this time, he would use troops to mine the coal after the government took over the mines. To that, of course, the coal operators decided to compromise once again. Workers across the coal-producing area of Pennsylvania received a 10% increase in pay. The significance in this event is actually not the increase in the pay. It is the different direction Roosevelt has taken in dealing with strikers. Listen, he hated anarchists, but he didn't assume that there was anarchy in these strikes. Let's go back to Roosevelt's 3 C's in his domestic agenda. We're going to look how he implemented those throughout his presidency. We'll start with his corporate regulation. You may remember that the railroads have been a focus of attention for many people throughout the years. In Unit 6, we saw how J.P. Morgan bought out and then consolidated the failing railroads during the Panic of 1873. You may also remember how Rockefeller agreed upon non-published rebates from railroads to get a competitive advantage over his competition. Lastly, you know the Populist Party and their call for government control of railroads. All of these things are now in national focus during Roosevelt's administration. We spoke about Ida Tarbell, who was the muckraker, and in her hit piece against Rockefeller, she exposed to the public how Rockefeller's use of unpublic discounts or rebates allowed him such a competitive advantage that he was able to create a monopoly on oil. Using the bully pulpit, Roosevelt urged Congress to pass a couple pieces of legislation in order to stop the abuse by the railroads. First was the Elkins Act in 1903. Here, the government would impose heavy fines on the railroads who offered rebates and heavy fines on the companies that accepted them. And they went further 3 years later in 1906 with the Hepburn Act, which said that railroads couldn't offer free passes to companies, and it allowed the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, to set maximum rates. The trusts, who are now becoming very unpopular in the public eye, can no longer use the railroads to gain a competitive advantage. Roosevelt used the railroads as an example of his nuanced antitrust sentiment. However, he was aware that these trusts have created an efficiency and a production during the Gilded Age that the world has never seen, leading to lower prices for consumers, and in essence that means that trusts are here to stay. He believed that there were good trusts, ones that kept the prices low and are helpful to consumers and the nation, but he also believed that there were bad trusts, ones that were exploitative and harmful to the well-being of the people. Here's Roosevelt. "If corporations were found seeking profit through injury and oppression of the community, it would be pursued and suppressed by all the power of the government. Where a company is found seeking profits through serving the community by stimulating production, lowering prices, or improving service, it would be encouraged to do more production by the fullest protection of the government." Roosevelt will forever be known as America's trust buster because he was the first president to attempt to take on and break up these large monopolies. His first target for trust busting was J.P. Morgan's railroad monopoly that we learned about back in Unit 6 in 1873, who now has a monopoly on the railroads in the Northwest. Morgan's railroad trust was called the Northern Securities Company. Using the Sherman Antitrust Act, Roosevelt sued to break up Morgan's trust, and the case eventually landed in the Supreme Court in 1904. In the court case, Northern Security Companies versus the United States, the court agreed with Roosevelt and ordered the railroad monopoly to be dissolved. Here's your textbook author. The Northern Securities decision jolted Wall Street and angered big business, but greatly enhanced Roosevelt's reputation as a trust smasher. His reputation as a trust buster increased in the years following when the Supreme Court sided with Roosevelt as he began dissolving monopolies in the industry of beef production, sugar, fertilizer, harvester, and many other key products. It's important to repeat that, though trust busting was popular at the time, Roosevelt thought that many monopolies were good for the United States. Here's your author. Bigness was not necessarily badness, so why punish success? Roosevelt's real purpose in assaulting the Goliaths of industry was symbolic, to prove conclusively that the government, not business, ruled the country. He believed in regulating, not fragmenting, the big business combines. The threat of dissolution, he felt, might make the sultans of the smokestacks more amenable to government regulation, as it did. Teddy Roosevelt wasn't the only or the best trust buster. In fact, his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft, will hold that crown. Teddy, in one celebrated instance in 1907, gave his personal blessing to J.P. Morgan's plan to have U.S. Steel absorb the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company without fear of an antitrust lawsuit. When Taft then launched a suit against U.S. Steel in 1911 after Roosevelt was out of office, the political reaction from Teddy Roosevelt was explosive. More on that later. Let's shift to the second C of Roosevelt's three C's, consumer protection. Here we'll focus on the meatpacking industry. In the early 1900s, American meat was so bad that European countries passed laws to stop the importation of meat that was created in America. Knowing this, of course, Congress was working on a piece of legislation to clean up American meat, but it was lingering in the House. Into this chaos steps a muckraker that we talked about before, Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair was an unabashed socialist and wrote the book The Jungle, mainly to use the fictional lives of his main characters and his limited research of the meatpacking industry to show how more socialist policies would be beneficial to the United States. Hilariously, though, the public focused on his gross explanation of the wretched conditions of the meatpacking plants in Chicago. The public fallout was focused on the horrid conditions of food production than the merits of the socialist system. Here's Sinclair. I aimed for the nation's heart, but hit it in its stomach. Here's your author, David Kennedy. The book described in noxious detail the filth, disease, and putrefaction in Chicago's damp, ill-ventilated slaughterhouses. Many readers, including Roosevelt, were so sickened that for a time they found meat unpalatable. The president was moved by the lonesome mess in Chicago to appoint a special investigation committee whose cold-blooded report almost outdid Sinclair's novel. Roosevelt, using the bully pulpit, urged Congress to pass the laws that had been lingering in Congress. What came of this was two pieces of important legislation that were both passed in 1906, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. The Meat Inspection Act required American meat to pass an inspection by independent investigators before the meat entered the marketplace. And the Pure Food and Drug Act required labeling of all ingredients on food and pharmaceuticals. Anytime that you see a labeling of ingredients on packaging, you can thank the Pure Food and Drug Act. The last C of Roosevelt's three C's is conservationism. The consumption of natural resources in the Gilded Age and the beginning of the 20th century was borderline wasteful. There was an assumption that American natural resources were unlimited and allowed for many individuals and businesses to mine and cut down vast forests, which led to a general worry by policymakers that the United States could be reaching the end of their resources. Congress passed many acts to help limit the wasteful usage, but it was generally unsuccessful. Here's Teddy Roosevelt in his annual message to Congress. We are prone to speak of resources of this country as inexhaustible. This is not so. The mineral wealth of this country, the coal, the iron, oil, gas, and the like, does not reproduce itself, and therefore is certain to be exhausted ultimately. And wastefulness in dealing with it today means that our descendants will feel the exhaustion of a generation or two before they otherwise would. With Roosevelt's urging, Congress passed the Newlands Act of 1902. This act used money from the sale of Western land to irrigate arid land to be put to better use. This, of course, is with the goal to increase the amount of usable land for development. Roosevelt continued to focus on conservation, addressing the issue of the rapidly shrinking forest. Teddy would set aside 125 million acres of forest as a federal reserve. As a symbolic gesture, he even banned having a Christmas tree at the White House. Roosevelt was a conservationist. He wanted to conserve natural resources for the wise use of American citizens. He eventually was at odds with people who did not want to conserve, but rather preserve natural resources, to leave them untouched. Groups throughout the United States sprang up who were dedicated to preserve the wild in its natural form. Groups like the Sierra Club, led by its leader John Muir, wanted to protect and preserve the West in its natural habitat. The two groups, conservationists and preservationists, were at odds with one another, and one conflict exemplifies their division was the conflict over the Hetch Hetchy Valley. In 1913, San Francisco decided to wall up the Hetch Hetchy Valley to be used as a water reserve for the West Coast. The Sierra Club and John Muir objected to the using of the valley for the reason saying, Hetch Hetchy was a temple of nature and should be preserved. And Roosevelt, who supported it, responded with, wilderness was a waste. It must be used wisely. Needless to say, John Muir and the Sierra Club are going to lose their battle. Through most of Roosevelt's presidency, he was wildly popular with the public, but some of that diminished in 1907 when there was a small recession in the United States. People in his own party believed that his progressive policies were hurting the economy. There was a split beginning to happen within the Republican Party, and Roosevelt was smack dab in the middle. The Republicans were dividing between the old guard conservatives and those who were looking cautiously on Roosevelt and his seemingly anti-business stance, and the progressives of the Republican Party, with which Roosevelt was a significant part. This is going to be important later, but for now, the Republicans seem to be in charge of their own destiny. However, Roosevelt is going to make an impulsive mistake that he is going to regret later. After his one-sided victory in the 1904 election, Roosevelt told reporters that he would not seek re-election after his term. So when 1908 came, Roosevelt reluctantly held to the impulsive promise that he made in the following election. But now he had to look for his replacement. Roosevelt's hand-picked replacement came in the form of the gorgeous, sexy hunk of a man, William Howard Taft. Taft was a close friend of Roosevelt, and Roosevelt believed that Taft would carry on his progressive policies. In the 1908 election, the Republicans nominated the hand-picked William Howard Taft, and the Democrats re-ran William Jennings Bryan. With the support of the still popular Roosevelt, Taft soundly won the 1908 election, and Roosevelt went off, literally, to Africa to hunt lions. Pretty fitting. Let's get some closure on Theodore Roosevelt and his presidency. Roosevelt was the first progressive president, and he enlarged the power of the presidency by using the bully pulpit and brandishing his big stick foreign policy to impose his will on Congress, corporations, and overseas foes. He shaped the progressive movement, and his square deal became the grandfather of what will be the New Deal of the Great Depression, when Theodore's cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would eventually take the presidency himself. William Howard Taft was a loyal Roosevelt supporter. They were very close friends, so he was an easy choice for Roosevelt to handpick. He has been helping in the Philippines. He was an aide to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt felt that he was simply going to carry forward his policies. But here's the problem. Taft
had a lot of big problems, no pun intended. He's not as charismatic as Roosevelt, and he shied away from controversy. He was passive toward Congress, which means he wouldn't use the bully pulpit like Roosevelt did. And he was a mild progressive, so he had some sympathies to the old guard Republicans. Just like we did with Roosevelt, let's jump right into William Howard Taft's foreign diplomacy. Critics are going to call it dollar diplomacy. And they're going to call it dollar diplomacy because the United States and Taft during this time is going to use United States funds in order to invest in projects in smaller countries and developing countries around the world. And the idea behind this is to make sure that foreign dollars aren't being funneled into the places that the United States wants to develop. For instance, in places like Haiti or in Panama, and also in Manchuria in China. What this dollar diplomacy is attempting to do is trade out old foreign loans and replace it with United States loans. There's going to be a lot of criticism of this because the projects that the United States is going to fund, not all of them are going to be successful. And many of the countries felt that this was increased United States intrusion into their business. We've mentioned it before, but it was Taft who is the true trust buster. He had 90 lawsuits against trusts, and it's going to be his administration that is going to bring down and eventually split up John Rockefeller's Standard Oil. And as we also mentioned before, he ended up going after trusts that Roosevelt supported. And that means the rest of Taft's presidency is really defined by the breakdown of the relationship between Taft and Roosevelt. Even though they were close friends initially, Roosevelt and Taft are beginning to be at odds with one another. What will add to it is going to be the issue of the tariffs. Many progressive Republicans are wanting a full reduction of tariffs, almost elimination of the tariffs. And old guard Republicans are wanting to keep the tariff high in order to protect the small businesses. So in response, of course, Roosevelt calls for a lower tariff as a private citizen, and the response is going to be the Payne-Aldrich bill, which is a slight lowering of a tariff, but most of the tariffs are going to be put into place. So this, to many people, is showing that Taft is moving more toward the side of the old guard Republicans than to the progressive Republicans. Additionally, Taft is going to have to deal with a lot of old Roosevelt-era hirings, especially a guy by the name of Gilbert Pinchot. So he's going to fire an old Roosevelt appointee for insubordination. This will additionally enrage Roosevelt and the progressive Republicans. And since Roosevelt and the progressive Republicans, even though Roosevelt is not president, since he's such a charismatic person, and he is the lifeblood of the progressive Republicans, it is going to split the Republican Party. As a matter of fact, Roosevelt is going to call that he is going to run again for president. But here's the problem. During the nomination process, the Republicans are still going to nominate William Howard Taft, and that causes Roosevelt and many of the progressives to leave the party altogether. And Teddy Roosevelt will leave the party, and he will start a new party, the Progressive Party. So the fascinating election of 1912 is going to pit two former Republicans, the Republican William Howard Taft against the very famous and very popular Theodore Roosevelt, who is now the leader of the Progressive Party. So this brand new Progressive Party is a party that is developed around Roosevelt. And as a matter of fact, many people called it the Bull Moose Party, as they were reflecting that Roosevelt is as healthy and as aggressive as a bull moose. So these two parties are going to go against one another in the election. But here is the issue. The Democrats are not split. The Democrats are going to nominate former college president Woodrow Wilson. Really, Roosevelt is going to do probably the best of any third party. He's going to gobble up many of the votes. But as you know, with third parties, he's not going to gain enough votes to beat both the Democrats and the Republicans. Really what he does is he ends up splitting the Republican Party votes. And you may say, well, what about the progressive people in society? Woodrow Wilson, he also is a progressive, and he comes with a progressive agenda that will satisfy progressive Democrats. And so because William Howard Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote, Woodrow Wilson is going to come out as the winner of the 1912 election. And so that's where we're going to stop this. And as we look forward, it is going to be clear that Woodrow Wilson, too, is not going to have smooth sailing for his presidency. And as we look to the next chapter, we're going to see that Wilson is going to bring his own progressivism, but Wilson will be leading the country when the world falls in to the largest war up to that point. We'll see you soon.